Personal experiences of living with borderline personality disorder, BPD, experiences of late diagnosis. Borderline personality disorder, BPD, is often misunderstood, both by those living with it and the professionals treating it. The disorder is frequently misdiagnosed or undiagnosed until later in life, which can lead to years of emotional turmoil, confusion, and ineffective treatments. For many individuals with BPD, receiving a late diagnosis can be both a relief and a challenge. While understanding that their struggles have a name can help make sense of their experiences, it can also feel overwhelming to realize how many years have passed without proper treatment or support. In this episode of the Borderline Personality Disorder, BPD, podcast, we will hear personal stories from individuals who received a late diagnosis of BPD. Their experiences highlight the struggles, frustrations, and emotional relief that can come with finally understanding their condition. These stories also emphasize the importance of self-awareness, early intervention, and support systems in navigating life with BPD. 1. Ella's story, the relief of finally understanding my struggles. Ella, a 41-year-old woman, shares how she lived with unrecognized emotional struggles for most of her life. For years, I had no idea what was going on with me. I just thought I was crazy or weak, she recalls. I would go from feeling amazing to feeling completely worthless in a matter of hours. Relationships were incredibly difficult, and I pushed people away constantly, but I couldn't understand why. Ella had experienced emotional volatility and relationship instability since her teenage years, but it wasn't until her early 30s that she was finally diagnosed with BPD. I had gone to therapy for anxiety and depression, but nothing seemed to work. It wasn't until I found a therapist who really took the time to listen and understand that BPD was brought up as a possibility. The diagnosis was a relief for Ella. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't just broken. There was a reason for my emotional reactions, my fears of abandonment, and my constant self-doubt, she explains. It was a relief to finally have a name for what I was going through, but it was also frustrating to realize that I had spent so much of my life struggling without the right treatment. Ella credits her therapy with helping her understand her emotional triggers and patterns of behavior. My therapist introduced me to dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, and it helped me so much. I started to realize how my emotions affected my decisions and relationships, and I began learning how to cope more effectively. 2. John's story, misdiagnosis and years of uncertainty. John, a 34-year-old man, recounts his struggles with misdiagnosis before finally receiving a correct diagnosis of BPD. For years, I was told I had depression, anxiety, and even bipolar disorder. None of those diagnoses seemed to explain the full extent of what I was experiencing, he says. I knew something was wrong, but I felt like no one was listening to me or understanding the depth of my pain. John's difficulties in his relationships were a constant source of frustration. I was in and out of relationships, feeling either totally engulfed by someone or pushing them away when things started to get too intense. My anger would flare up without warning, and I felt like I couldn't control my emotions, he explains. I'd go through these extreme highs and lows, and then feel like a failure when it all fell apart. It felt like I was living in a state of chaos. It wasn't until he saw a new therapist in his early 30s that he was diagnosed with BPD. I had to face a lot of things about my past, but when the diagnosis came, it felt like a light bulb went off, he says. It made so much sense. I finally understood that my extreme emotional reactions, impulsivity, and difficulty maintaining relationships were part of a condition, not just random personality flaws or weaknesses. For John, the late diagnosis was both a relief and a frustration. On one hand, I felt validated. But on the other hand, it was hard to accept that I had gone through so many years of my life without the proper help, he says. I was left feeling like I could have been treated much earlier, but I tried to focus on the fact that I am getting the help I need now. 3. Mia's story, struggling with identity and self-worth. Mia, a 29-year-old woman, struggled with identity disturbance and low self-esteem for as long as she could remember. I had always felt like I didn't know who I was. My sense of self seemed to shift depending on who I was around, she says. I would be extremely attached to people one moment and then want to cut them out of my life the next. I felt like I was constantly chasing something, but I didn't know what. Mia sought therapy for anxiety and depression in her early 20s, but she didn't get an accurate diagnosis of BPD until her late 20s. I was in therapy for years, but I didn't feel like my experiences were being fully addressed. It wasn't until I found a therapist who specialized in personality disorders that the possibility of BPD came up, Mia explains. At first, I didn't know what to think. It was overwhelming to learn that my identity issues and emotional instability were part of a disorder, but it also gave me a sense of clarity that I'd been missing. Mia's diagnosis helped her understand the root causes of her struggles with self-worth and relationship patterns. Knowing that my emotional ups and downs weren't just me being too sensitive was a relief. I finally started learning how to build a more stable sense of self, she shares. It's still a process, but therapy has given me the tools to start feeling more secure in my identity and more compassionate toward myself. 4. Ryan's story, delayed diagnosis and the struggle for proper treatment. Ryan, a 38-year-old man, shares how his late diagnosis of BPD led to years of feeling misunderstood and untreated. I've always had a volatile temper and difficulty handling emotions, but I was never told why. I got into trouble a lot with friends and family, and I was constantly told I needed to get over it or just calm down, he recalls. It wasn't until I was in my 30s and dealing with some pretty intense relationship and work issues that a therapist finally suggested BPD. Ryan's frustration with the late diagnosis is palpable. I spent so many years with no explanation, feeling like I was the problem, he says. I had trouble with jobs, friends, and family. I'd push people away and then feel devastated by it. I'd do things that didn't make sense, like making impulsive decisions or becoming enraged over small things. The diagnosis, though late, helped try and make sense of his behaviors. When I found out I had BPD, it was like everything clicked into place, he shares. I started learning about my impulsivity, my fear of abandonment, and my inability to handle emotions in healthy ways. Therapy gave me insight into why I act the way I do, and I've started learning better ways to cope. Ryan now understands that while the diagnosis came later than he would have liked, it is still an important step toward healing. It's been hard to come to terms with the fact that I could have been getting help years ago, but I'm trying not to regret it. The most important thing is that I'm getting the right treatment now. 5. Sophie's story, rediscovering self-worth after late diagnosis. Sophie, a 30-year-old woman, shares her experience of struggling with BPD for most of her life without knowing it. I was always the dramatic one in my group of friends. I couldn't seem to keep my emotions in check, and I felt shame about it, she says. I never understood why I couldn't control my reactions, and I started believing I was just a bad person. Sophie's path to diagnosis was long. I went through years of therapy for depression and anxiety, but no one ever considered that I might have BPD, she shares. When I finally got the diagnosis, it was a huge relief, but it also left me feeling guilty for not having known sooner. Since her diagnosis, Sophie has been focusing on rebuilding her self-worth and emotional regulation. It's hard to accept that I struggled for so many years without the right treatment, but now I'm learning to be kind to myself and take things one step at a time, she says. I'm still in therapy, and I've started feeling more comfortable with who I am. Conclusion. The stories shared by Ella, John, Mia, Ryan, and Sophie reveal the complex emotional journey that individuals with borderline personality disorder, BPD, often face, especially when diagnosis comes later in life. For many, the late diagnosis of BPD offers both relief and frustration, relief from the confusion of unexplained struggles, but frustration over the years lost without proper treatment. However, these personal experiences also highlight the hope and healing that can come from receiving the correct diagnosis and learning to manage the challenges of BPD. If you or someone you know has experienced a late diagnosis of BPD, remember that understanding the disorder is a crucial step in emotional healing. Therapy, self-awareness, and support systems are key to navigating life with BPD and building a healthier, more fulfilling future. In future episodes, we will continue to explore the journey of living with BPD and how individuals can overcome the challenges of this disorder. Stay tuned for more insights into borderline personality disorder.